December 3, 1944. A transport truck rumbled through the frost-covered hills of eastern Tennessee, carrying 47 female prisoners of war toward an uncertain future. Inside the canvas-covered vehicle, German women sat in rigid silence, their faces pale and drawn beneath the dim winter light filtering through the fabric. They wore the remnants of their auxiliary corps uniforms, now threadbare and stained from weeks of transit through military processing centers. But it wasn't the cold that made them shiver. It was the gnawing emptiness that had become their constant companion, the hunger they never spoke about because speaking of it made the pain more real. Elfrida Hartmann, who insisted everyone call her Frida, pressed her hand against her hollow stomach and tried to remember the last substantial meal she had eaten. She was 20 years old, though the gauntness in her cheeks made her appear older. She had served as a radio operator in France, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. Now she was an enemy prisoner being delivered to a place she couldn't pronounce, in a country she had been taught to hate. The propaganda had promised them that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant torture and starvation. Looking at her fellow prisoners, Frida realized they were already starving. The Americans wouldn't need to withhold food as punishment. They were arriving half dead already. Beside her, Waltraud Kessler sat with her eyes closed, perhaps sleeping, or perhaps simply too weak to keep them open. Across from them, Gertrude Zimmermann, who everyone called Trudy, clutched a small cloth bag containing her only possessions. Her lips moved silently, and Frida recognized the shape of prayers she herself had stopped saying weeks ago. What God would listen to the prayers of defeated soldiers? The oldest among them, 28-year-old Brunhilde Fischer, maintained the rigid posture of her training despite the obvious exhaustion in her frame. She had been a nurse, had seen the wounded and dying, and had learned to hide her fear behind a mask of professional competence. The truck slowed, then stopped. American voices shouted orders outside. The women tensed, preparing for whatever came next. When the canvas flap opened, cold December air rushed in, and with it came a smell that made Frida's empty stomach clench with sudden, painful awareness. Something was cooking. Not the thin gruel or stale bread they had subsisted on during transport, but real food. The scent was rich, savory, utterly foreign, and so overwhelming that several women gasped involuntarily. An American soldier, young and red-cheeked from the cold, gestured for them to exit the vehicle. His expression wasn't cruel or hostile. If anything, he looked uncomfortable, perhaps even sympathetic. As Frida climbed down on unsteady legs, that impossible smell grew stronger. Somewhere in this camp, someone was cooking breakfast. Her propaganda-trained mind told her this was a trick, a cruelty designed to torment them. But her starving body didn't care about propaganda anymore. It only knew that somewhere close by there was food. The mess hall was larger than Frida had expected, with long wooden tables arranged in neat rows and windows that let in the weak winter sunlight. The 47 German women filed inside under guard, their eyes adjusting to the warmth and light after weeks of cold transit facilities. Captain Margaret Dalton stood near the entrance, a tall woman in her mid-30s with steel-gray eyes that assessed each prisoner as they passed. She had overseen male prisoner camps before, but this was her first assignment with female captives. The War Department had given her specific instructions about maintaining order and discipline, but nothing in those instructions had prepared her for the skeletal frames and hollow faces now filling her mess hall. Staff Sergeant Earl Cunningham emerged from the kitchen, wearing a flour-dusted apron over his uniform. He was a broad-shouldered man from rural Georgia, with hands scarred from years of farm work before the war. When Captain Dalton had assigned him to cook for the new prisoners, he had spent the previous night lying awake, thinking about his own daughter, who would have been close to these women's ages if she had survived the influenza epidemic of 1918. He couldn't look at these enemy prisoners without seeing his Sarah's face, without remembering how she had wasted away, despite every desperate effort to save her. The German women stood uncertainly beside the tables, unsure whether to sit or remain standing. Corporal Horace Perkins, a lanky 22-year-old from the Tennessee mountains, gestured awkwardly toward the benches. Slowly, hesitantly, the women sat. Frida found herself between Waltraud and an older woman whose name she didn't yet know. They waited for whatever came next, their faces carefully blank, refusing to show weakness or hope. When Cunningham and two kitchen assistants emerged carrying large trays, the smell that had tormented them outside became overwhelming. The sergeant began placing plates in front of each woman, and Frida stared at what appeared before her with complete incomprehension. On the metal plate sat two large, golden-brown biscuits, split open and covered with a thick, creamy sauce studded with crumbles of sausage. Steam rose from the food, carrying with it a richness that seemed impossible. Beside the biscuits sat scrambled eggs, actual eggs, fluffy and yellow. A small portion of fried potatoes completed the plate. It was more food than Frida had seen in months, more food than she had eaten in a single meal since before the Allied bombing had destroyed the supply lines. Around her, the other women sat frozen, staring at their plates as if they might be hallucinations. Captain Dalton watched the prisoners' reactions with growing unease. She had expected gratitude, perhaps even tears of relief. Instead, she saw confusion and something that looked almost like fear. These women didn't understand that they were simply being fed a standard American breakfast. They thought this was some kind of test or trick. She nodded to Cunningham, who picked up his fork and mimed eating. His message was clear. This food was real, and they were permitted to eat it. Earl Cunningham had learned to make biscuits and sausage gravy at his mother's elbow in their farmhouse kitchen outside Macon, Georgia. She had died in 1938, taking with her the warmth that had made their small house feel like the center of the world. His father had followed 2 years later, and Earl had enlisted shortly after, carrying with him the recipes and techniques his mother had taught him during countless Sunday mornings. Cooking had become his way of honoring her memory, of keeping alive the lessons about dignity and care that she had instilled in him from childhood. She had always said that feeding someone was an act of respect, that no matter how little you had, you shared it with grace and generosity. When Captain Dalton had informed him that he would be cooking for female German prisoners, Earl's first reaction had been to refuse. These were enemy soldiers, women who had served the same regime that was killing American boys across Europe. But that night, alone in his quarters, he had pulled out the photograph he carried of his daughter Sarah. She had been 7 when the influenza took her, small and fragile and utterly helpless against the disease that ravaged their community. He remembered holding her burning body, watching her waste away, feeling utterly powerless to save her. The memory of her hunger in those final days, when she was too sick to eat but still asked for her mama's biscuits, had never left him. Looking at the German women in his mess hall that first morning, Earl saw that same helpless fragility. These weren't the fierce warriors of propaganda posters. They were starving girls, some barely older than his Sarah would have been. Their hollow cheeks and sunken eyes spoke of prolonged deprivation, of bodies consuming themselves to survive. Whatever sins their country had committed, whatever role they had played in the war, they were human beings who needed food. His mother would have fed them without question, would have considered it an obligation rather than a choice. Earl had decided he would do the same. He had woken at 4 a.m. to begin preparation, mixing flour and buttermilk for biscuits, browning sausage for the gravy, preparing eggs and potatoes. He cooked the way his mother had taught him, with attention to flavor and texture, refusing to simply fulfill a requirement. If he was going to feed these women, he would feed them properly. The biscuits were tender and flaky, the gravy rich with cream and seasoned with black pepper and sage. It was the same breakfast he would have made for his own family, the same meal his mother had served on cold Sunday mornings when the farmhouse smelled of comfort and love. Now, watching the prisoners stare at their plates with expressions of disbelief and confusion, Earl felt something shift in his chest. These women didn't trust this kindness because they had forgotten what kindness looked like. They expected cruelty because cruelty was what they had known. He picked up his fork again, took a deliberate bite of his own breakfast, and smiled at them with all the gentle patience his mother had once shown him. The first bite changed everything. Frida had lifted her fork with trembling hands, half convinced that the food would be snatched away before it reached her mouth. But no one stopped her. The biscuit was still warm, soft as cloud. And when she tasted the gravy, something inside her chest cracked open. It was rich and savory, with herbs she couldn't identify, and a creaminess that seemed impossible given the wartime shortages she knew existed everywhere. She had been told that America was suffering, that their economy was collapsing under the weight of the war effort, that their people were starving just as Germans were starving. Yet here was abundance. Here was butter and cream and sausage served without hesitation to enemy prisoners. Around her, the other women were experiencing the same revelation. Waltraud ate slowly, methodically, as if afraid that eating too quickly would make her sick. Trudy had tears streaming down her face, though she made no sound and didn't stop eating. Brunhilde, the nurse who had maintained her rigid composure through everything, sat with her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, staring at the food as if it were a mathematical problem that didn't calculate correctly. The propaganda had been so certain, so convincing. Americans were the enemy, brutal and cruel and morally inferior. Yet here they sat, being fed better than they had eaten in their own country for years. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Frida tried to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been taught. Perhaps this was exceptional, a single generous meal before the cruelty began. Perhaps they were being fattened like livestock before slaughter. But even as her mind raced through these explanations, her body betrayed her with its desperate gratitude for the food. She finished everything on her plate, using the last piece of biscuit to soak up the remaining gravy, unwilling to waste a single drop. When the kitchen assistants came around offering seconds, Frida watched in amazement as several women timidly raised their hands, and they were served again without comment or judgment. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Breakfast arrived each morning with the same impossible abundance. Biscuits and gravy, eggs, sometimes bacon or ham, occasionally grits that the American soldiers tried to explain but which remained mysterious to German palates. Lunch brought sandwiches made with soft white. Bread, thick slices of meat, and crisp lettuce. Dinner featured roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon. It was ordinary American military food, nothing special by the standards of the camp's American personnel. But to women who had subsisted on increasingly meager rations for years, it was incomprehensible luxury. Trudy began paying careful attention to how the food was prepared. She watched through the serving window as Sergeant Cunningham worked in the kitchen, noting his techniques and ingredients. She started asking questions in her limited English, pantomiming when words failed. How did he make the gravy so smooth? What gave the biscuits their tender texture? Cunningham, surprised but pleased by her interest, began to teach her. He showed her the ratio of flour to fat, the importance of cold butter, the technique of cutting rather than stirring. Food became a language they could share across the barrier of war. 3 weeks into their captivity, the German women had begun to regain small amounts of weight. Their faces no longer looked quite so skeletal, and their uniforms, which had hung loose on emaciated frames, were beginning to fit properly again. Captain Dalton documented these changes in her reports to the War Department, noting with clinical precision the improvement in prisoner health and morale. But she couldn't quite capture in official language what she witnessed each morning in the mess hall, the way these women still approached each meal with a mixture of disbelief and barely contained desperation. Frida had started to recognize patterns in her fellow prisoners' behavior. Some, like Brunhilde, ate with careful control, never finishing everything on their plates, as if saving food for an emergency that might come. Others, like Waltraud, ate quickly and efficiently, their bodies still operating on the survival instinct that told them to consume food whenever it appeared, because you never knew when the next meal would come. But it was Trudy who surprised everyone on a cold morning in late December when something inside her finally broke. Sergeant Cunningham had made an especially large batch of biscuits that morning, and when Corporal Perkins came around offering seconds, Trudy raised her hand. Her plate was already clean, wiped spotless with her last piece of biscuit. Perkins placed 2 more biscuits on her plate, covering them with a generous ladle of gravy. Trudy stared at the food for a long moment, her fork frozen in her hand. Then, without warning, she began to sob. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. The mess hall fell silent. The other German women turned to look, uncertain whether to comfort her or pretend they hadn't noticed. The American guards exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to respond to this sudden emotional collapse. Captain Dalton approached carefully, kneeling beside Trudy's bench. In her careful textbook German, she asked what was wrong. Trudy struggled to speak through her tears, switching between German and broken English. She explained that she hadn't eaten this well since before the war began, not even as a free citizen in Germany. Her family had owned a small bakery in Stuttgart, and even there, with access to flour and sugar, they had been rationed to near starvation. The ingredients for these simple American biscuits, butter and cream and white flour, had become impossibly precious commodities in Germany. Here, in this prison camp, she was being offered seconds of what would have been a feast at home. The shame of it overwhelmed her. She was eating better as a prisoner than her mother and sisters were eating as free women in Germany. She was gaining weight while her family, if they were even still alive after the bombing raids, were slowly starving. The guilt was unbearable, made worse by the fact that she was grateful for the food, that her traitorous body craved these meals and looked forward to them with desperate anticipation. She felt like she was betraying her family with every bite, choosing her own survival over solidarity with their suffering. Sergeant Cunningham sat with Trudy in the kitchen after that morning's breakdown, a cup of weak coffee between them and a notebook open on the metal table. Captain Dalton had given permission for this unusual meeting, sensing that something important was happening, something that transcended the normal boundaries between captor and captive. Trudy had stopped crying, but her eyes were still red-rimmed, her hands still trembling slightly as she held her own cup of coffee, the first she had tasted in months. Cunningham spoke slowly, using simple words, and Trudy responded in her halting English, supplemented with gestures and drawings when language failed them. He asked her about the bakery in Stuttgart, about what her family had made before the war. Trudy's face softened as she described the rye breads, the pretzels, the Christmas stollen, rich with dried fruits and marzipan. She drew pictures of the shapes, tried to explain the textures and flavors. Her mother had been a master baker, she explained, trained in the traditional methods that had been passed down through generations. The bakery had been their pride, their livelihood, their identity. Then came the rationing, the shortages, the slow strangling of their craft as ingredients became scarce and then impossible to find. Cunningham listened with genuine interest, asking questions about techniques and timing. He had never made a proper German pretzel, had never even tasted stollen. The idea fascinated him, this glimpse into a food culture he had only encountered as an enemy abstraction. He showed Trudy his mother's recipe for biscuits, written in faded pencil in a water-stained notebook. He explained about buttermilk, about the importance of not overworking the dough, about his mother's insistence that biscuits should be made with love or not at all. Trudy studied the recipe with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient text, asking questions about measurements and temperatures. Word of these kitchen conversations spread through the camp. Other German women began requesting permission to learn American cooking, while some of the American guards expressed curiosity about German recipes. Captain Dalton, recognizing the value of this cultural exchange for camp morale, established a formal program. 3 afternoons each week, small groups of prisoners could work in the kitchen under supervision, learning to prepare American dishes while teaching their own culinary traditions in return. Frida found herself learning to make cornbread, a strange golden bread made from meal rather than flour. Brunhilde, with her medical background, was fascinated by the nutritional aspects of different foods and began documenting recipes with scientific precision. The exchange became more than just cooking lessons. It was a vocabulary for discussing things that were too difficult to address directly. When Waltraud taught Corporal Perkins how to make spätzle, she talked about her grandmother's farmhouse in Bavaria, about Sunday dinners that felt like a lifetime ago. When Perkins showed her how to make Tennessee chess pie, he talked about his own grandmother, about the sugar rationing that had made such desserts impossible, even in America. They were sharing memories, grief, and loss through the medium of flour and eggs and sugar. Food became the language through which former enemies discovered their common humanity. January 14, 1945. Sergeant Cunningham presented Captain Dalton with a proposal that made her initially skeptical. He wanted to organize a special Sunday dinner where prisoners and guards would eat together at the same tables, sharing the same food in the same space, without the usual separation between captor and captive. It was unprecedented, possibly against regulations, and definitely risky from a security standpoint. But Cunningham argued that the cooking exchanges had already broken down many barriers, and that a shared meal would formalize what was already happening informally in the kitchen. After 3 days of consideration and consultation with her superiors, Dalton approved the plan with strict conditions and heightened security measures. The preparation became a collaborative effort. Trudy and Frida worked alongside Cunningham and his kitchen staff, planning a menu that would incorporate both American and German elements. They settled on roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and, for dessert, a simple apple cake that Brunhilde remembered from her childhood. The German women threw themselves into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even themselves. They were cooking not as prisoners fulfilling obligations, but as participants in something meaningful. The kitchen filled with conversation, laughter, and the occasional argument about proper seasoning that transcended language barriers. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear. The mess hall had been rearranged so that the long tables seated mixed groups rather than segregated ones. American guards sat beside German prisoners, officers beside enlisted women, former enemies beside each other, in a configuration that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Captain Dalton gave a brief speech in English, which Frida translated into German. She spoke about the importance of recognizing shared humanity even in wartime, about the difference between political systems and individual people. Her words were carefully chosen, neither apologizing for the war nor pretending it didn't exist, but acknowledging the strange circumstance that had brought them all together. The food was served family style, with large platters placed in the center of each table. People passed dishes to each other, served one another, and began the awkward process of conversation across enemy lines. Corporal Perkins found himself sitting between Waltraud and another prisoner named Irmgard. He attempted jokes that didn't quite translate, and they responded with German humor that he didn't fully understand. But somehow, they all laughed anyway. The tension that had defined their interactions for weeks began to dissolve in the simple act of breaking bread together. Cunningham watched from his position at one of the tables, seated beside Trudy and an American private from Kentucky. He saw his mother's wisdom proven true once again. You couldn't easily hate someone after you had shared a meal with them. The apple cake was served with fresh cream, and its familiar cinnamon sweetness brought tears to several German women's eyes. It tasted like home, like childhood, like everything they had lost. But they were tasting it here, in this impossible place, surrounded by people who should have been their enemies, but who were passing them dessert and asking for the recipe. Something fundamental had shifted that afternoon, something that couldn't be easily undone. February brought the first letters from Germany through the International Red Cross postal system. Captain Dalton distributed them during evening assembly, calling names from a list, while the German women waited with expressions ranging from desperate hope to barely contained dread. Not everyone received letters. Some women had listed addresses in cities that no longer existed, swallowed by Allied bombing campaigns. Others had families in regions now occupied by Soviet forces where mail service had completely collapsed. Of the 47 women in the camp, only 19 received correspondence that first week. The contents of those letters would haunt the camp for months to come. Frida's letter came from her younger sister, Katrin, writing from a displaced persons camp near Hamburg. Their apartment building had been destroyed in a firebombing raid the previous July. Their mother was alive but ill, suffering from malnutrition and respiratory problems caused by living in inadequately heated temporary housing. Katrin herself was working in a factory for food rations that provided barely enough calories to survive. She wrote matter-of-factly about conditions that sounded apocalyptic. People were eating potato peels, tulip bulbs, anything that might contain nutrition. The black market thrived but required currency or goods that ordinary families didn't possess. Children were dying of diseases that should have been easily treatable. The letter ended with a line that made Frida's hands shake. "We are glad you are safe, even if you are with the Americans. At least there, we hope you have food." Waltraud's letter brought even worse news. Her family's farm in East Prussia had been overrun by Soviet forces. Her parents and younger brother were missing, their fate unknown. A neighbor who had managed to flee west reported that the entire village had been evacuated or worse. Waltraud sat on her bunk, reading the letter over and over, as if repeated readings might change the words on the page. She hadn't eaten dinner that evening, couldn't bear the thought of food while her family's whereabouts remained a mystery. Brunhilde, whose own letter had brought similar devastating news, sat beside her in silent companionship. There were no words adequate for this kind of loss. The contrast between their situation and their family's circumstances became unbearably stark. That evening's dinner had included pork chops, mashed potatoes with real butter, and green beans. The German women sat before plates of food that represented more nutrition than their loved ones might see in weeks. Some couldn't eat at all, pushing their food away untouched. Others ate mechanically, driven by bodies that demanded sustenance regardless of emotional state. The guilt was overwhelming and inescapable. They were prisoners, yet they lived better than free Germans. They were captives, yet they were safer and healthier than their own families. Trudy found Sergeant Cunningham in the kitchen after dinner, her face pale and drawn. In her improving English, she asked him a question that had been tormenting her. "Why do you feed us so well when our people are starving? Why do you show us this kindness when we were your enemies?" Cunningham was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because," he said slowly, "starving you won't feed them. Being cruel to you won't help your families. We do what's right here because that's all we can control." March brought warming weather and official notifications about repatriation procedures. The War Department had established protocols for returning prisoners to Germany, with transportation scheduled to begin in late April. Captain Dalton called individual meetings with each prisoner to explain the process and assess their readiness to return home. What she discovered during these conversations troubled her deeply. When she asked the standard question about their willingness to be repatriated, the responses were far more complicated than yes or no. Women who should have been eager to return home instead expressed paralyzing uncertainty and, in some cases, outright fear about what awaited them. Frida's meeting with Captain Dalton lasted nearly an hour. She spoke with painful honesty about her conflicted feelings, her improving English allowing her to express nuances she couldn't have managed months earlier. She wanted to return to help her mother and sister, wanted to contribute to rebuilding her destroyed country. But she was also terrified of the hunger, the deprivation, the possibility that she might become another burden on her already suffering family. More than that, she had changed during her months in American captivity. She had learned things about her country that made her question everything she had once believed. Going back meant facing people who would see her as a failure, a captured soldier corrupted by enemy influence. The other women expressed similar anxieties during their own meetings. Waltraud, who still had no news about her parents' fate, asked Captain Dalton what would happen to prisoners who had nowhere to return to. Could they remain in America? Could they apply for displaced person status rather than repatriation as enemy nationals? Dalton had no answers, only promises to forward such questions to higher authorities. Brunhilde, always pragmatic, pointed out the medical reality. Many of them had gained 15 or 20 pounds since arrival, their bodies finally recovering from prolonged malnutrition. Returning to starvation conditions would undo all that healing. How could they help rebuild Germany if they arrived already weakened by hunger? One evening after dinner, a group of women gathered in the barracks for a conversation that felt almost like conspiracy. They spoke in hushed German, aware that what they were discussing bordered on treasonous. Trudy voiced what many were thinking. What if we asked to stay? Not forever necessarily, but until conditions in Germany improved. Until we knew our families were safe. Until the country was stable enough that we wouldn't be additional burdens. The idea hung in the air, simultaneously appealing and horrifying. Choosing to remain with their captors rather than return home felt like the ultimate betrayal of everything they had once fought for. But Frida countered with an uncomfortable truth. They hadn't chosen this captivity, but they could choose what they did with it. They had learned skills here, had regained their health, had begun to understand perspectives they had never considered before. Perhaps returning home stronger, healthier, and wiser was more valuable than returning immediately but broken. Perhaps survival wasn't betrayal. Perhaps taking care of themselves first would ultimately allow them to better help others. The debate continued late into the night, with no clear resolution. Each woman would have to make her own impossible choice. 23 years later, in 1968, Frida Hartmann stood in her kitchen in Chicago, teaching her teenage daughter how to make biscuits and sausage gravy. Her hands moved with practiced confidence through the familiar motions, cutting cold butter into flour, adding buttermilk until the dough just came together. Her daughter, born in America and bearing an American name, watched with the casual interest of someone who had never known hunger, had never understood food as anything more than daily sustenance. Frida didn't begrudge her this innocence. It was what she had wanted for her children, this freedom from the desperate appreciation of every meal that still marked her own relationship with food. She had chosen to stay in 1945, one of 11 women who had requested displaced person status rather than immediate repatriation. The decision had been agonizing. But Captain Dalton had helped them navigate the complex bureaucratic process. Frida had eventually brought her mother and sister to America in 1948, sponsored by the Henderson family, who had first employed her as a housekeeper. Her mother had cried the first time Frida served her biscuits and gravy, understanding without words what that particular meal meant to her daughter. It was the taste of survival, of unexpected mercy, of the moment when everything had changed. Trudy had returned to Germany in 1946, carrying with her Sergeant Cunningham's mother's biscuit recipe written carefully in a notebook. She had reopened her family's bakery in Stuttgart, incorporating American techniques into traditional German baking. She still made biscuits on Sunday mornings, serving them to her own children with stories about the American sergeant who had taught her that food could be a language of reconciliation. She corresponded regularly with Frida, their letters crossing the Atlantic with recipes and updates about their vastly different but surprisingly parallel lives. Waltraud had discovered her parents alive in a refugee camp and had returned to help them rebuild, but she had never forgotten the meals in Tennessee, the impossible abundance that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. She taught her nieces and nephews to make sausage gravy, explaining in careful detail about the American camp where enemies had shared tables and former captors had offered seconds without judgment. The recipe became part of her family's tradition, a reminder that humanity could survive even in wartime. Brunhilde had stayed in America, becoming a nurse at the same hospital where she had trained after her release from the camp. She married a doctor from Tennessee and made biscuits and gravy every Sunday morning for 40 years, until arthritis finally made the cutting and rolling too difficult. Even then, she supervised her grandchildren in the kitchen, passing down not just the recipe but the story of what it represented. The meal that had confused and overwhelmed her, that had challenged everything she thought she knew about enemies and allies, had become her way of teaching about grace and unexpected kindness. Sergeant Cunningham had died in 1962, but his legacy lived on in the hundreds of women he had fed, in the recipes he had shared, in the small acts of dignity he had insisted upon, even when regulations didn't require them. At his funeral, 3 former German prisoners attended, traveling from different states to pay respects to the man who had shown them that redemption was possible.